This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Ashley Smith-Purviance, who teaches in the Department of African American and African Studies at Ohio State University. Her work is focused on Black girlhood, memory, and the relationship between ethnography, self-authorship, and lived experience. She is the author of the forthcoming book titled Unschooling Black Girls, Navigating Suburbia, Anti-Black Girl Violence, and Mechanisms of School Survival, and has produced the Digital Humanities Project, The Rolling Archives of Black Girlhood, a digital scrapbook that amplifies the voices of Black women and girls by uncovering the spaces and experiences that shape them. In this discussion, we explore the relation between gender and ethnographic research, childhood and its place in the Black studies imagination, and how Black study expands the archive of Black life. Good morning, Ashley. How are you today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm really excited about this conversation. So welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. Was really happy we found time and day to talk. I think that your perspective, the sort of way you've entered the field and sort of way your work contributes to the field of Black studies is super important and is a perspective that'll be really valuable to the series. So thank you for making the time, but also thank you in advance for your thoughtfulness and contributing to this series.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So we'll get into talking about your work and sort of how you imagine the field of Black studies and all of these sorts of things. But I wanted to start with a question more about your own journey and to ask you, what drew you to the study of Black life? What drew you to Black studies? And the thing that I always want to attach to this is what sustained you in relation to this kind of work?
So I think that I'll start. Honestly, I believe my trajectory started probably within high school, but maybe even before then. But I would say high school was a very pivotal experience for me because I went to a predominantly white high school on the south side of Chicago. It was a Catholic school as well. My grandmother really believed in her grandchildren being educated, and for some reason she was just very connected to the Catholic faith. So I went to Catholic school pretty much my entire life. But this school in particular was I would say it was a very difficult experience. I think that I always heard the narrative that you have to kind of leave home to go get something better. And so I grew up on the south side of Chicago in a all-Black neighborhood. And so I'm now transitioning into going into a school in a predominantly white space. The area was not suburban, but it had a very suburban feel. And I will say that for myself and even some of my friends, it was just a very difficult time. While I do feel like I experienced a bit of childhood that I did enjoy, especially within my adolescent high school period, going to school within that particular school context was very difficult. I experienced a lot of anti-Blackness. There was just a lot of blatantly racist experiences that I had along with some of my friends as well. We were a very small makeup within the school. And so that really kind of shaped this trajectory that I'm in right now, which is very interesting because I wasn't able to obviously foresee that at the time. It just felt like a place or a moment of struggle. And I will say I internalized a lot of the things that I experienced at the school and kind of took it out on myself in a way, whereas I was having struggles with my identity, particularly being a Black girl. And that really has played a role in like who I am today and the work that I'm doing now. So I will then just say from high school into undergrad, I went to DePaul University for undergrad. I studied business management, but honestly, towards the end of my educational career there, I honestly felt more drawn to Black studies, but also education in particular. But I think I just got so far and so deep into business that I was like, let me just graduate and go a different route after this. But I would say I was kind of radicalized in undergrad. I was I was participating a lot with Black Student Union. I was taking Black Studies courses at the time. And so I was just kind of getting immersed in this new self that was actually deeply passionate about understanding Black life and Black experience coming out of that predominantly white high school experience. Um, and then, like I said, towards the end, I got really passionate about Black youth in particular and their experiences into education, and more specifically, actually higher education. So I did my master's at Syracuse in higher education. And for some reason, I was like, it's not enough for me to just focus on college students. Like, they made it to college. And so I was deeply invested in, like, what was K through 12 like? Again, reflecting on my own experience. And so that led me to go into education policy. Once I got there, I noticed that there was some communication about Black youth, but a lot of it, honestly, was from a deficit perspective. Like, they're struggling, they're underachieving, they're not doing well. And so I was also introduced to Black feminist theory through one of my courses with Dr. Catherine Moeller. And honestly, when I got introduced to that text, it was one of Angela Davis's pieces about Black women and their experiences through enslavement. I cried in class, and I cried reading the piece before I got to class. And a lot of that really had to do with feeling like I finally understood, like, this is not our fault. This is not my fault. I had a bit more of like a structural awareness and analysis. And to be honest, I just had the language to understand like why we were facing racism, sexism, etc. Why it just felt so hard a lot of the times, why oppression existed for Black people in a very specific way. And so that really pushed me to immerse myself into studying or getting more in tune with Black Studies scholarship. It was a lot of outside reading that I had to do that I didn't feel like I was getting in my education program. And so I honestly will say, with the help of my advisor and other faculty that I have connected with, as well as other students across institutions, it was a lot of like self-work to really dig deep and to kind of get this understanding of Black studies. I will say I did gain that through gender studies in particular, because my minor was in gender and women's studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And so that's where Black feminism really became a really big site for me. But I will say, through that, my research trajectory shifted to focus on Black girls, young Black girls in particular. And I became aware of this whole field of Black girlhood studies. And so that's where my work is landing right now, that I think is a very important conversation to have through the realm of education and also Black studies, because it seems as if Black girlhood studies has a home in education policy, but also just education broadly. And it also seems like it's getting more, I guess, becoming more visible in Black studies as well, too.
So that's super interesting in so many ways. I mean, part of, I've said this a million times on this podcast, but, I write a lot and I like writing and researching, but the reason why I do any of this stuff is because I love being an educator, and just that idea that education, because you kept coming back to like this transformation of yourself, right? Rather than, and even when you said, Angela Davis, and I just last semester taught a seminar on Angela Davis and heard such similar things about, she gave you a vocabulary or words but those words and those vocabularies in the sort of event of education, the event of learning, is so like, I mean, it's a complete transformation and making of the self.
Yes.
I mean, it's absolutely why it's the center of culture wars, because like you can damage and suppress people, right? If not outright oppress people when you block that. But yeah, and when you were at DePaul, I'm also interested in, how Black studies came into your into your world. Like, was it something you sought out, or was it one of these moments where you just kind of randomly happened to sign up for a course?
I
Because
think
by the way, I find that hilarious. You're like, I just had to finish the degree. That is like, we've all been there.
yeah. Yeah, I was like, I gotta finish. Money was an issue, so I was like, let's just get out of here. But I will say honestly through Black Student Union because a lot of the Black Studies faculty at DePaul were also really involved with Black Student Union. And then there were a lot of students, obviously, that were actually majoring in Black Studies or African American Studies at DePaul University, and so I was like connecting with them. I am a part of a sorority. I am a member of Delta Sigma Theta, and one of the members of my sorority was the president, or actually two of them were the president of the Black Student Union too. So of course, I'm just like naturally being around students and communities of students that are deeply immersed in Black studies. Some of our conversations they would bring from their courses into Black studies, like general body meetings, and so I was kind of learning through them. And then I was like, okay, I'm actually really interested in this. And so I started to just take up some of the classes, unfortunately, as only elective classes. So I remember like I took a class called Blacks in Love. And then I also took a class about the histories of South Africa in particularly. And I was just so drawn to Black studies. Unfortunately, I just think the way that the institution, and maybe I do think it's an institutionalized thing that Black studies wasn't set up to be easily included into my curriculum as a business
Mhm,
student.
mhm.
And so I had very limited classes that I took. But again, it was about the work, which is Black studies too, right? Like being in community with folks was honestly another way that I felt I engaged Black studies too.
No, yeah, I mean, for those of us which is all of us, who are in Black Studies departments, whatever name they have, we can critique the sort of accounting model of why we should exist or not exist or be downsized or grown. We can critique that, but ultimately there ought to also be an existential investment in our numbers, like that numbers speak to something healthy about what we do and something good about what we do. And I asked that sort of how you found your way to the field, to those classes, to department stuff, because as you were talking, it goes to this question of universities have communities. There's often this distinction between the university and the community, and that's part of Black Studies is how do these things relate. But also universities have communities, and there's always this question for me in my own departments in the now and in the past, how are we connected to those communities? Because those are probably the way people wander into our department rather than a catalog or something like that. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, thinking about just, I mentioned community and departments or community classroom questions. I want to ask you about how you imagine the field of Black Studies. What's the sort of portrait that you work with? And I think those portraits, are a window into our own values, but also the future of the field. And just what that portrait of Black Studies is for you in relation to its origins, which had that sort of the tension built into it between the demand students had to study and have available courses and courses of study of the Black intellectual tradition, which disciplines had neglected, if not outright blocked from study. But it was also in the late 1960s and early 1970s, that moment of the radicalization of Black liberation struggle that had collapsed the distinctions between classrooms and communities, between political struggle and study. And so I think that tension, I never want to call it a contradiction, but that tension I think is still with us in the field. And I think we still wrestle with how to make sense of it. And so, it's 55 or so years since the founding of Black Studies. That's a long time ago, but the tension's still with us. And so I'm always curious to hear folks talk about how, what portrait of Black Studies they're working with and how it relates to this founding tension.
Yes, so I think this is a really beautiful question, especially to think of it as a portrait, because I feel like Black Studies is so expansive, and also the ways that I have been immersing or engaging with Black Studies feels like not a one way or like a one-off thing. And so I think a huge part of it is this intersection of like creativity, but also this at the intersection of like deeply theorizing and intellectual work. Again, thinking about struggle and community work, but then also art and really kind of shaping our own narratives through disruption. And I guess disruption in the sense of, one, thinking about the academy, but also just thinking about white supremacist cultures that tell us to act and think and write and talk and behave a certain way. I feel like Black Studies disrupts and really kind of theoretically tears all of that apart. And we create anew within that. We intervene and we also make space for ourselves that is really beautiful. And so I think for my work in particular, I was very inspired by, I think, at the intersection of Black studies and education, this idea of Black educational studies, which some scholars of education have tried to coin or just kind of introduce as a practice or a field in and of itself that has always been there. And so Black folks have always had to navigate, right, segregation, had to navigate violence within schools and school systems in ways that constantly recreate inequality and disparity for Blackness and Black youth in particular. And so I think about like the Black liberation struggle, the Black Panther Party, right? These liberation schools and community schools that they created, and a lot of how my colleagues and my friends and I talk about survival programs. And a lot of that was also it was responding to a moment, but also disrupting how we do schooling, how we see education, how we interact with each other in a more caring way, in a more even creative way, but also that is deeply rooted in our social activism and our social movements, and thinking about Black life and sustaining Black life and living. And so I believe that my work sits there. And at the same time, there's also the deeply theoretical work that I have been so inspired by. And so obviously Black feminism and Black girlhood studies, but also I would even say a lot of the work out now around like anti-Blackness and how are we interrogating, right, human for Black folks in general. How are we interrogating these identity categories and such as gender, so I'm interested in how we exist within Blackness, but then also what does anti-Blackness look like? How does gender manifest for us, but also an ungendering to site spillers in particular. I am really interested in age, childhood, youthfulness, and this disruption or this lack of accessibility to a sense of innocence, I guess, that we often assert with childhood. And so I think a lot about whose voice at these intersections should be at the center. And so I think Black Studies has really pushed me to understand that we have always written our own stories. And so as I'm working alongside Black girls, it's important for me to bring them into this conversation. Yes, I have been a Black girl before. Yes, I might even still identify as a Black girl during certain moments. But I think that as a field of Black girlhood studies that rests within Black studies in particular, we have to have Black girls telling us. They know exactly what they're experiencing. They know exactly the kinds of life and living that they hope to achieve. They know what they want liberation to look like as well. And they can imagine that alongside us, right, with them. And so it's not that seeking to like guide them or tell them what they need, but I actually listen to them. And so I think that they are theorists in this canon of Black studies as well too. And so this has been like really where my work is sitting at. And I think more recently I have a newer project called The Rolling Archives of Black Girlhood, where I'm trying to do this, what I'm calling digital scrapbooking and digital archiving. I have like a website for it, but I'm trying to archive the spaces that we create as Black women and girls for our own spaces of respite, right, for survival, to experience joy, to have a moment, right, of liberation, because I think we're still trying to achieve that. So it is, it's temporary. And I think with that has come in like this creativity and this art. And so a lot of the work that is on the site is art that Black women and girls have created themselves. I have a big highlight on roller skating, just because that is something that I did as a young Black girl to find, just to kind of build community, yes, but also to kind of, I think that's what helped me through high school, to be honest with you. It was a place that I was at every Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. I don't know how I got my mom to let me spend that much time in the skating rink, but
Yeah.
it really was a way for me to kind of escape and really
Mhm.
kind of hone in on this craft that was more than a hobby. And some of the girls that I grew up with skating with, I've interviewed them and included them in this project. And even they say like this is more than just a hobby. This is survival for us. And so that's a really long answer, but just to kind of paint this picture of what Black Studies is. And I think that I value deeply like the work of academics, right? The work of Black feminists, the work of theorists that we formerly know as theorists, but I also deeply honor the everyday work of like my grandmother, for example, and the deep influence that she had on me and just the way that she cared for me, just the way that she loved me. And so I think that all of us as Black folks are a part of this canon and tradition and just the everyday ways that we exist and we move and we live.
I love that. That was fantastic. Thank you. And I'm really struck by what you said there at the end, and it, what caught me in the middle of what you were saying was when you said thinking about Black girls as theorists rather than people who need to be theorized upon or theorized over or interpreted. And it makes such an interesting way of thinking about that sort of Black studies dilemma, right? Which is, what is the relationship between Black studies and community? Often I think that means, people often imagine that as like we are like bringing our political insights to communities or being political educators. And that can be really wonderful work. It can be missionary and patronizing, and it can be all kinds of things. But it's a whole different way that you were talking about the relationship between Black studies work and community when you're talking about, what if these girls are theorists? What if a grandmother is a historical narrator, right, rather than somebody who has to be interpreted? And that, for me, is some of the most interesting ways of thinking about community in relation to Black studies, which is just vernacular life as something more than randomness, right? It's its own theoretical work, because that's where language comes from. That's where worlds come from. When you're talking about roller skating, it's like it's survival. It's a world, and world making is not just random activity.
Right.
I know I'm just sort of restating what you said, but I was really moved by a lot of parts of that. Thank you. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah, and that's, again, just what community means in relation to Black studies is such an expansive and complicated thing. I mean, I think in some ways that should be a secondary podcast to this series. Like, how do we actually say the word community and what do we mean by it? So, and this is a great contribution to that conversation. Thank you. And let me turn a little bit. I know you've sort of started to move into it a little bit in what you were just saying. Ask you about your own work. That it has social scientific methods, of course, cultural studies, and gender studies, which is, this mix has so much insight for the field of Black studies. So I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about how you understand your own work and your own projects in relation to the past of Black studies. Sort of, does it fit in terms of that story of 50 plus years, but also what new horizons is it opening up? What boundaries is it pushing?
Yeah, so I think I will say that for me, I noticed there were Black feminists in particular who would reflect on their childhood experience. And this goes back to, again, like engaging Black girls' voices and not just including them, but doing it in the right now. And so I know like Bell Hooks, for example, like will reflect on her young Black girlhood. And I think I was just kind of like, well, what do Black girls right now today have to say? And I think that guided my work. I think for me, going through school, I was like, wow, I didn't really have much space to really discuss what I was feeling, discuss what I was thinking, discuss the violence that was happening to me. Perhaps I would not have put so much of that blame onto myself if I was able to communicate or just talk with other people besides just my friends. And so I think that really guided the work. So once I got into focusing on Black girls' experiences within schools, because I was trained in education, I think I was really, again, inspired by the work that Black folks have done as it relates to educational intervention or educational disruption and creating our own space. I think a lot about, so there's a scholar, Kiana Ross, who's at Northwestern, who talks about Black educational spaces as like fugitive spaces for Black youth. And so I was also really curious about how, one, the example of the Black Panther Party, but also like what other ways are we doing that today as a bit of an honoring. And so I did get connected in my own scholarship or from my research project to these predominantly white suburban middle schools in particular. And there were very small populations of young Black girls. And again, the way that they were being talked about as like always fighting and just causing a lot of ruckus at the school. They were the school's problem. At least that's how it seems like they were framed. They were underachieving, etc. This is the language that was being said to me. And so I was less invested in doing a study on them and like just kind of taking to heart what the administrators or what the leaders were telling me and just running with that versus like creating a space alongside the girls. So I did that with Black women that I had already had connections with, again, deeply inspired by this historical canon that we always create a space and make a way in Black studies, but also there were specific scholars like Ruth Nicole Brown who had created a space for young Black girls that I kind of modeled my work after, and I created a space, co-created a space alongside 5 other Black women, alongside the girls within these schools that was a part of the study. And so a part of the research was understanding how they experience anti-Blackness every single day. And I think, again, going back to like the past work in Black studies, a lot of that was drawn from Black feminists, right? Telling us that Black women have a very particular experience within this world, right? Within the ways in which they are positioned, how they aren't seen as women, how they are experiencing various forms of harm. Obviously, I was kind of making sense of that and how it exists within a school space. And so I wanted to hear what the girls had to say. So a lot of my work was honestly asking them, what is it like to be here every single day? There was one girl who literally said, I feel like my teacher hates me. This school is a hellhole. These are 10, 11-year-old girls that are already kind of theorizing about what's happening to them. And then a part of the study was to just kind of explore how they felt their experiences were in Black Girl Magic as well too, and to really create what I describe as a fugitive Black girl space for them, where it was still within the same confines of this violent school building, but how are they able to like have a moment of respite, to just be with themselves, to build community, to really focus on their identity development. We talked about a lot of painful experiences, but we also did a lot of joyful things. We created a lot of artwork, a lot of collages. Sometimes we just dance. Sometimes we just jump double dutch. Like sometimes I expanded this work to different locations like in Rhode Island, and we did like a roller skating session, so it was just about curating moments of joy alongside them as well too. And I think that's where there is a bit of honoring of the past of Black studies, right? And then also what can be offered anew is continuing to uplift their voice, uplift their stories, but from them directly. And I think even in the method, so Black Studies has really taught me to not just read a methods book like on ethnography, for example, and just be like, okay, now I'm gonna go and surveil these people and like literally just take notes on every little movement and action that they do. Black Studies tells us like that is literally harmful. And so it has taken me to disrupt that as well. I think about Savannah Changé, who actually kind of pushed me a bit in my work to suggest that like, yeah, you'll create this study, but maybe Black girls don't want to participate in that way. And how about you let them tell you how they will show up in the study, if they even want to participate, what they will and won't show up for, what they will and won't tell you. And I think that's also a very revolutionary or maybe even like just a very political positioning to say I'm not going to give too much because I know that this research and this work where it's going to sit, and obviously I hope that it lands right in Black communities. I hope that it lands with people that I deeply care about rather than just a site within a violent academic space.
Mhm.
But I do think that it is important to have this like ethical understanding of the work in which I'm not here to just take from Black girls and then go and do my own, like have my own career successes or whatever. Like this work
Mhm.
was something that we together created. And so I think that's something new too. Like what does Black girlhood methodology look like? And I've done some of
Mm.
that collaborative work with other scholars, Tiffany Neochai, Asia Reynolds, and also Stephanie Tolliver, who are also Black girlhood scholars. And we've thought about and conceptualized like how do we do research in a way that is healing, in a way that is also honoring, in a way that's celebrating, in a way that is not harmful to Black girls. So yeah, I think that's what is anew and also how I've tried to honor the past of Black studies too.
I love that. I mean, this last bit you were saying about rethinking methodology in terms of these kind of collaborative, participatory, sort of expanding what we think about as the relationship between, what is rendered or reckoned in an essay or a scrapbook. The scrapbook idea, I think, is super interesting as a form of scholarship too. But thinking about how that impacts just the question of methodology, both as you were saying, connected to the past of Black studies, which has had this sense of a relationship between thought and community, from its very beginning, but thinking about how we ought to rethink methodology. I mean, I think that kind of work, and I know other people are doing it here and there too, but I think, I do think this is one of the new horizons for Black studies is what does the experience of Black studies tell us about how we ought to think about methodology differently? I know that people do it and have views on it, but this a really robust and intense exchange of that. And I don't want to say standardization because that's maybe a problematic term for some people, but some like extended discourse that sort of makes us think about methodology itself, like that really distinctive Black studies thing, rather than we all have our methodologies that study Black people, right? And instead, like, what does Black studies tell us about how that very act, what you all are doing, how that very act actually makes you revisit the notion of methodology and break it up a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
if not completely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, good. Publish everything you can on that so that we can all learn. I mean, I cannot tell you, like, I think that question of methodologies is so huge.
Mm.
And so in some ways, this as a segue to this next question I had for you, which is in some ways a question of methodology, but also pedagogy and intellectual sensibilities, which is, your PhD, as you said, was in education policy. Which, you may want to say something about that, I guess it would be a sort of disciplinary education, but also maybe something different. But now you're in Black studies. You also talked about the certificate or minor in gender studies. And so there's this interesting movement that you have between area studies or multidisciplinary studies and something like a discipline for your PhD. So I'm interested in asking the question, which you've already partially answered, how that's impacted your research, that movement into this multidisciplinary, antidisciplinary, however we want to put it, area studies space, but also even how it helps or informs how you shape a classroom, how you put a classroom together, how you teach as well as research.
Yeah, that's really good questions. In terms of the influence or the impact on my research, I will say, honestly, it has kind of opened up the possibilities of my work. I will say that education and education policy is very disciplinary. At some point, it often felt like, even when I just wanted to talk about Black women and girls' experiences, there needed to be a connection to schooling or education in some way. And that sometimes was very difficult. I also find or felt that I was often pushed through various audiences within education to give solution, right? So I've talked with teachers and maybe done some consulting work with teachers, and it's like, okay, we know all the issues. Like, this is great, but like, what's the solution? And sometimes I think that Black studies, and even in a lot of ways, gender studies, has kind of pulled me back away from a solution as like quick fixes, because obviously within education, there are still these issues persist, especially for Black youth and for Black girls in particular. And so I'm not quick to draw conclusions or go to a solution like, oh, just create these Black Girl Magic clubs within your schools. No, I would actually say that's not the solution, because then you kind of reify this whole idea that it's okay to just put that label onto Black women and girls to figure it out themselves. Like, you don't have to address the ways that you are harmful or perpetuate anti-Black girl violence, which I theorize in my work as well, too. And so I will say that that's what Black studies and gender studies, but definitely Black studies, has done for me, is allowed me to just sit with it. I love theory. I love thinking. I love theorizing about our day-to-day experiences. And so it's literally allowed me to just sit with what's happening, to deeply think about it, to sit with the things that the girls were saying to me, like to sit with their quotes, to forefront their quotes. Like, even when I'm writing, like, so much of it is from their words, using their language as well, too, in connection with theories that I also utilize or understand. And so I think it's kind of removed this pressure in a lot of ways to be very interdisciplinary or anti-disciplinary in a lot of ways, in many ways. And then I would say it allowed me to open up possibilities, because, as I mentioned with the Rolling Archives project, I would have never thought I could do that in education. And like, I did actually receive a fellowship through the National Academy of Education and the Spencer Foundation to support that work of the Rolling Archive. But I, again, sometimes would be like, do I need to make this distinct connection to schooling? And to be fair, I think that my connection is thinking about these community sites or spaces as sites of education beyond the physical school building. A lot of that is also a shout out to my advisor, Dr. Bianca Baldrige. But I think that I am able to do work that feels more deeply personal. I'm able to engage in more autoethnographic work, right? A lot of this rememory work that I've cited Toni Morrison, and thinking about how do we kind of reflect on these past experiences, past histories, but do it in community as well. I also just, for example, roller skating, like, I never would have imagined I could explore that a bit deeper through a Black studies lens. Like, I do kind of try to mirror, or at least marry, this idea of like fugitive space with the practice of roller skating, right? And so that's been something that is really useful for me, is to kind of take the work that I thought was super disciplinary because I was focused within the school, and expand outside of the school and imagine Black life, Black girlhood studies, Black feminist theory, Black studies in general, and keep it centered and grounded on community.
Yeah. So let me actually use that as a way of sort of blending in this other question, because, what you've articulated so well in these last two comments is the impact of Black studies sensibility on methodologies and the way we actually make knowledge, right? Or make knowledge out of knowledge, or embellish, however we want to think about that. I mean, that's part of the methodological question, I guess. But it, for me, is a really interesting way into this question about what is the sign of the success of the field of Black studies, thinking like we're distant into the future. Because one of the motivations, of course, about that led to the founding of Black studies was with students saying, we have nowhere to study Black life, right? The literature department, history department, sociology, etc. So one sort of version of the success of Black studies is like in the future, seems increasingly distant with every week that passes lately, but I gotta pause, catch my breath a little bit on that. But to say in the future that the success of Black studies would be that the disciplines, right, that needed to be corrected by the founding of Black studies have now come to the study of Black life in a way that Black studies is not really necessary. So in that sense, like the future of Black studies in its success is to no longer be needed, to no longer exist. The other sign of the success of Black studies is to have formulated something distinctive about it, where we say, this is what Black studies is. It doesn't distribute back to disciplines in any kind of way. And that actually the articulation of that to the extent to which we have or have not done that, right? But in the future, having done that. And I ask that, and I know I keep mentioning this sort of Black studies methodology question. We don't really have any collections of debates about what is a Black studies methodology. We have core texts, we have histories of the profession, but we don't have that, like, what is the one thing, not the one thing, but like, what is something that you would really ground the distinctiveness, which to me raises this question about, like, what do we want out of our future? So for all that's to say, how do you imagine the future of Black studies as its ultimate success? Like, what would be that sign or index?
I think, honestly, it's continuing to not use the metrics of the academy in very disciplinary fields to determine that success. I think it would be the continuation of us or Black studies as a field, like thinking anew. And I keep saying that, but I really do find that Black studies continues to intervene and be an intervention in a lot of ways that are necessary. So whether it's through the theorizing, whether it's through the actual like research methodology, but I also find it in the writing. I find it in the artwork. I find it in who we've made space for in theorizing, right? It's not just thinking about a particular population of the Black community, right? Like we've included Black feminists, Black queer and trans theory. We've included some Afro-pessimism, Afrofuturism, right? So I think that we are constantly expanding on like who's included in the conversation, how we're thinking about Blackness and Black life beyond how we are kind of forced into a bit of standardization or a bit of metrics of success to say like, oh, we have X amount of studies on Black life now in education or in social work or in, I think it's great that we have opened up the conversation, but we actually have to continue to exist because even within very disciplinary fields, Blackness and Black life and Black people just become an object of study rather than actually understanding the complexities of Black life, right? And so I think that's why we have to continue to exist, to push those bounds disciplinarily, but also to just exist as we are as Black studies, which is moving to other world making. I think you use that language. I love to use that language a lot because where we are right now is not where we need to stay. I see the United States is politically trying to move backwards. Black studies is going to continue to move forward. Like, we're not going back. We're not going back in the ways that we do work in research. We're not going back in the ways that we have had to, in a sense, I think that we're constantly moving forward and honoring the past ways that we have engaged community and also thinking anew and how do we continue to engage community? Like, who's given the lecture series, right? Is it only just the academic scholar or is it the community organizer? Is it, right, this very well-known Black woman or Black mother in the community who has oftentimes taken care of all of us, I think that we continue to think about and create space for ourselves beyond the bounds of the institution. And I think we importantly so have to think about that even more today because there is this persistent attack. Black studies within the academy, within the institution is always in a very precarious place, but even more so now. And so what does it look like? I think for future questions is like, what does it look like to continue to exist and move our work and our depths, whether it's our scholarship, our writing, beyond the confines of this space. Like, yes, importantly so, we needed to have Black Studies exist in the academy. In the event that it is taken away, like, we continue to do Black Studies, and what might that look like? I think we need to think more deeply about that and in community. And a lot of us are already doing that work. And so I don't want to minimize or pretend like we're not. I just want to honor it and uplift it even more. But yeah, I think too, I will just say, I think this might be related to the last question that you asked me, but I think Black Studies, in addition to like the methods and all of the theorizing, the writing. So I really deeply love Christina Sharp's work, where she does this Black redaction work, where she kind of blacks out a portion of like a quote or something like that to really get us to see what it is that Black folks are saying to us in particular. And I absolutely love that, because who would think that that's a form of writing for us, right? We do it in arts, we do it in literature, we do it in education now. I think that we continue to find new ways to communicate in very beautiful and empowering ways for ourselves. And I just hope that I know that will continue in the future.
I love that. I mean, that's a really fantastic response, because the way I framed the question was sort of, do we need to narrow the field to sort of isolate the distinctiveness? And you were like, no, it's the ever expansiveness that actually is the undigestible. I really love that as like an inversion of the way I asked the question. And I think that, as you said, it's not just like, let's do that. It's like, well, that's already happening. So let's understand that that's exactly the thing that makes it both live outside of whatever institutions might make of it, downsizing or upsizing departments, right? So that work is expanding anyway, but also as a way of not focusing our departments. I mean, I just think about this acting like we're about to grow our department, which we're not, because the state of Maryland is in a budget crisis. But, what it means to expand the department, what would it mean to expand the department on the notion of expansiveness, as you put it, rather than like, let's focus and have a specialty as a department, or even in our own research. I mean, I take that as part of, like, listening to you talk, part of the challenge to my own thinking is like, how is that expansiveness that I also value? So when you were talking, I was like, yes. But also, how have I actually made that my own research, right? How have I done that, not just in profession, department, but in my own thinking and writing? So all that is to sort of spontaneously sort of testify to that. I think that is like a really, really fantastic way of thinking about it. I thank you for it. And maybe it's a sort of almost like an answer to this next question already, but I wanted to ask you what you think Black Studies has done well, but also maybe what it has not done particularly well.
Yeah, I think not to like be repetitive, but definitely the ways that we have opened up the field beyond where it was maybe 50 years ago to invite new areas of thought and disruption. I think leaning into the humanities work has been really powerful and impactful, especially for me as a person that does a lot of humanities and community engaged work. I find that Black Studies has more so welcomed that within our field, I guess within the academy in particular. Oftentimes I was told it'll be hard to get into Black Studies, because you have to have these, degrees, or you have to have this particular like theoretical contribution. But I find that, again, being somebody that has been formally trained in education policy, I find that Black Studies, the positions that I've had in Black Studies have been really welcoming and oriented towards the community engaged work that I'm doing. And so I find that is very beautiful. That has been occurring over the last couple of years. I think there has been a lot of theoretical intervention, and that has brought out new debate even within Black Studies. And I think that debate is actually healthy and important, because it means that we're constantly pushing our thought and our thinking beyond just the foundational texts, which we want to honor those, but of course we have to forward movement in our thinking as well too. And so I actually really appreciate the debate, especially with my work being at the center of some debate within Black studies as well too. I think that that has been very fruitful. And I think I don't know that I would say there's anything that we are not necessarily doing well, but I will just, I guess, frame it as like continuing to do or continuing to improve upon, is to just staying grounded within our um theorizing, right? Black critical theory, Black feminism, Black queer and trans theory. I also think that we continue to be like a site and a space of intervention and creation in the meantime. I think one thing we have gotten right, we've always talked about abolition, but I think it's definitely been uplifted even more so within the last couple of years. And so I know that, I'll mention Kiana Ross again, but I think about her work because she talks a lot about in the meantime, right? So in the context of schools, we know Black youth are having these very difficult experiences with schools. So maybe the intervention is to abolish schools, but we know that our youth are there. And so in the meantime, what is the work that we are going to do as they are continuing to attend schools? And I think about Christina Sharp's like wake work. Like, what are we doing in the midst of this world that continues to exist as we are thinking about how to abolish, how to disrupt, how to think anew, and create anew in actual like tangible ways. And so I think for Black studies to just always continue to be open in that sense. What is it that we right now need to let go of? What do we need to move away from in order to get to this true state of abolition, which might be right around the corner from liberation? I know that's like debatable, because
Mm-hmm.
liberation feels very far and fleeting sometimes. But in the sense of just trying to honor the work that we do, I think it is necessary to keep thinking in that way.
I love that. Thank you. So if you say, your response to this last question, closing question, might just be go back, rewind to what I just said. But I'm interested in, as a way of wrapping up. What is the issue you would want us all to think about, or the question you would want us to all ask?
Hmm. Um, I think I would just say, where do we go from here, and who are we responsible or answerable to is another question I would state. So where do we go from here is obviously what does the future look like, but also, and how do we craft that future, but like who should be with us and alongside us as we move forward and think and create. Who aren't we paying attention to right now? And not necessarily paying attention to, but of course, I'm going to bring this back to youth. Like, how much are we staying connected to our youth? I know as an educator, I always hear, youth are the future, right? But I think within Black studies, there can be more space made for our young people in particular, especially because historically, right, they have birthed Black studies on campuses. They are often like the first people to stand up in an activist, like through activist movements. And so I think even more so now, it is important to stay collaborative and collective, and be answerable to them. And yeah, I think those are the main questions that I would say should be our focus for the future.
I love that. Thank you. And Ashley, I was looking forward to this conversation. I knew it would be a really great contribution to the series. This has really been fantastic. You've given me a lot to think about. I know everybody who listens is going to think the same. Everything from who a theorist is to how we listen and how we make knowledge and where we identify world-making activity and the future of Black studies. This is so much here for folks to think about. So, I appreciate your time because it's every week is a busy week in academia. But I really mostly just thank you for your thoughtfulness. It's been really important contribution to the series. So I appreciate that a lot.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me again. I really appreciate what you all are doing with the podcast. So I'm really grateful to be a part of it.
Yes. Excellent. Well, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.